Hi, I'm Clive Priddle. This is The Current, and I'm delighted to introduce today Akiba Solomon and Kenrya Rankin. They are extensively published writers and authors, and they are the authors specifically of How We Fight White Supremacy, a book that you guys wrote and edited and published in March of 2019. So here we are, a year later, and the whole country is convulsed by race and the conflict and the reaction to the deaths of Black people in the streets of America. So your book feels very prescient. It also asked a slightly, at the time, a tough question. How do we fight white supremacy? Which seemed maybe on the outer edge of a lot of people's radar, but suddenly now it feels like it's an urgent part of everybody's conversation. So you must have very mixed feelings about the last few months. And I'd like you just to tell me how you think now about your book and the people you spoke to for that book. How is it resonating for you in the present? How do you feel the contributions stack up? Have you relooked at any of them and thought, wow, we got that right?
I think, what you say about mixed feelings, I can relate to quite a bit, because when we worked on the book, it was coming off of, an incredibly rich period surrounding protests and discussion about police violence. And then Trump got into office and pretty much hogged the mic from so many other issues. And so we actually came up with this book idea. Kenrya came up with the idea and asked me to join in it before Donald Trump was the president. And so the book that we thought we were going to do changed after Trump, because again, everything was so directed to Donald Trump that it was hard to talk about systemic issues. And so now even the language of systemic issues and even the language of racial justice is so ever present that to a certain extent it's a shock to the system. I mean, to hear, to see on Amazon video like Black Lives Matter, or like Gushers Candy had solidarity with Black people is just it's like jarring. And the question for me really is, what does this actually mean? Like, how will this stick? And how will the story be told? Because I think there's a real danger of sort of corporatizing these concepts.
So that's really interesting. The subtitle for your book talks about Black resistance, and in the moment, at least, the protests seem to cross a lot of races and classes and age groups. It feels like everybody's joining in this resistance. Do you think is that viable? Can everybody join in the resistance to white supremacy?
I think, of course, everybody can and should. I think that in this moment, just like in moments past, it's going to continue to be Black-led. I think that's one of the things that I'm really proud of us for doing, is exploring all these different modes of resistance and giving people what we hope is a blueprint to get there. And helping people to, I think one thing that I've heard a lot from my friends is that everyone is sliding into our DMs with "Oh, I'm so sorry that this is happening. How can I help?" question. And while I appreciate that folks want to find their way into the resistance, I'm also like, it's a whole lot of resources out there, including one that we wrote, that can help you do that. And what I tell people is, a couple of things. Like, one, you need to find a way to do this that doesn't involve the labor of Black people and other people of color, whether that be emotional or physical. Like, don't text us and DM us and ask and tell us that you know that your silence is violence, and then ask us what you should say, because there's things out there that should tell you. I also ask them to really, gather their folks. So when you want to head out to the streets and resist and find your way in the same way that we are, bring your people along with you so that you can be a part and have a larger contingency and help to grow the numbers of the movement. And also, I have been directing people to throw their financial support behind Black-led organizations because, again, just as in the '60s, Black folks were leading movements. That is what is happening, and we all need to be, not just white people, also Black people and other people of color, supporting financially the folks who are putting their lives on the line every day. So much of this moment, it's interesting because on one hand, it feels the same as it always has, because there's never been a moment when we haven't been out there putting our lives on the line for our freedom. But then I think that there's something that's different about this, right? I think everybody feels it, that it feels like there was a bit of a tipping point where, to your point, Clive, white folks have joined in the movement and gotten on the streets. And I think it has to do with the fact that we're all kind of raw right now. Like, if we've been doing what we're supposed to do, we've been in the house for weeks. But more than that, we've seen this administration bail out companies while ignoring the people who most need help. We've seen the novel coronavirus claim Black lives at a disproportionate rate than it has other lives, even as our leaders decide that they want to pander to armed white people who want to get haircuts and reopen states. And I think that when we saw a white cop kneel on a Black man's neck for almost 9 minutes, and when we found out that the cops in Louisville ran into a woman's home and killed her in her bed, we got to a point where we couldn't take it anymore. We were already raw. Like, a lot of this feels like deja vu. I remember in 2014 when Akiba and I were running color lines, and we would have days where there had been so many deaths that Akiba would be like, yo, we got to pack it up for today. Like, we would be so emotionally wrung out from the work of covering what was happening and the responses to it that we just couldn't. And I think that we've gotten to the point again where we just can't.
I agree so much with the importance of the context of this time. And, many people have said it in varying degrees of subtlety that this moment isn't just about police violence. It's about state violence and the many forms that it takes. I also think this particular video, which I have not watched, by the way, I made a decision that I'm sort of ambivalent about, but I decided I didn't want to watch that because when I saw like a Gayle King on CBS Morning News saying, I have no words.
Once again, I say, thank goodness that there's videotape. I think as the daughter of a Black man and the mother of a Black man, this is really too much for me today. I'm still rattled by that last story. And I'm still so upset, Vlad. I'm so sorry. I'm still so upset by that last story where the man is handcuffed underneath a car where people are pleading, please, he can't breathe, and we're watching a man die. So we go from that story now to this story where she falsely accuses a Black man on television. I mean, I don't even know what to do or how to handle this at this particular time. I know that this is... I am speechless. I'm really, really speechless about what we're seeing on television this morning. It feels to me like an open season, and that it's just not sometimes a safe place to be in this country for Black men. And today is too much for me.
Or like visibly shaken Lester Holt. I mean, these are people who have been in broadcast forever. And for them to just say like, I don't know what to say. I was like, I definitely, I can't do that right now. But that said, I think the video itself, because it's so slow, and even the still photos that I saw of a white cop kneeling on the neck of a Black man whose head is partially underneath the car with his hands in his pockets, really does lay bare the undergirding of policing in America. And so even these questions sometimes about how do we reform, or are there a few bad apples, or, what kind of trainings can we use, or, what kind of implicit bias can we examine, or what kind of, how do we de-escalate? Like all of these things, I'm not in any way saying that these things aren't worthy. What I am saying is that it seems like this particular video and this particular killing was so purposeful. This was not a mistake. It wasn't someone shot somebody in the moment. It wasn't, he was afraid for his life. It wasn't anything. It was just literally someone kneeling on somebody's neck for 9 minutes. And so there's no way to escape that particular incident. And coupled again, like Kenrya said, with people being cooped up for so long and all of the sort of senseless death and economic destruction, and it being clear that folks who are already embattled in terms of livelihood, like this is something we've never seen. So have, be in a situation where you have like 14 million people out of work, and you have people on furlough, and you have people homeschooling their children, or you have all manner, you have elderly folks dying, all of that happening, and then watching somebody just for fun, it seems like, kill someone is really shocking.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about the fact that Trump changed everything in terms of, I guess, the way that we have these conversations, partly because he's so incredibly unfiltered that he says the things that you would assume that a smart person would have the sense not to say, but he says them anyway. And
he says the quiet parts out loud.
He says the quiet parts out loud. He seems to enjoy baiting people's reactions. I still am staggered that he could mention George Floyd's name in the context of the stock market after the man has been killed. I can't understand how you can put that together in somebody's head.
Hopefully George is looking down right now and saying there's a great thing that's happening for our country. There's a great day for him. It's a great day for everybody.
So do you think possibly that because there's no camouflage with Trump, because there is somebody, who is so unsympathetic, so transparently, instinctively racist, that he's forced a lot of people to admit that this is real? You can't deny it with him. You can deny it with some other people because they can sort of slipperily talk around it. He doesn't talk around it. He marches straight through it. And it's just an extraordinary environment. I wonder how you feel about having this man as your president right now. And of course, you want him done, but what do you look when you look at the office of the presidency? What do you ask yourself?
Okay, so I think that there are a lot of people who continue to be able to look directly past the racism. I think that we knew that he was a racist before he was elected, when he came out and said that Mexicans were rapists and murderers. And I think that 53% of white women still voted for him. So I think that there are folks who are willing to vote and lead with their whiteness above all else, even to their own detriment. And I think that that continues to happen. And yes, I think that there are folks who have finally, in this moment, because of the reasons that we just talked about, gotten a glimmer of just how much of a white supremacist this man is, and the ways that he uses all the parts of that. We call them like the contributors to white supremacy, how he invokes ableism and transphobia and race, like literally all of the isms and the obias and xenophobia and all the things that you can think of in order to be a trash bag person. But I think also that there are a lot of people who don't care, because he's still lifting them up. They still get to sit on a safe rung at the top of the ladder of white supremacy, and so it doesn't matter to them. I think that there are some people who do care, and the reason that they care is because they agree with him. And so it's not even a passive kind of, oh, okay, this is okay. It's an active, yes, we got our guy at the top right now. And so it supports them. So I guess that makes it really clear how I feel about him. Wow.
I mean, I would just add that, Trump for me is one in a long history of overtly white supremacist politicians and officials. And so if we look at history, Trump actually fits in many ways with more people than the sort of question of concealed racism. Trump ran on racism. He ran on white supremacy. Trump scheduling on Juneteenth a rally in Tulsa where there is this renewed, not just the depth of the massacre, the genocide in Tulsa, but the renewed knowledge of it via the show Watchmen on HBO and the popular culture's engagement with that. For him to, on Juneteenth, where there's, again, a growing knowledge of this holiday all of a sudden, and also this sort of corporate celebration of it, and Tulsa, which has this renewed popular knowledge among, beyond other genocides that have occurred, for him to say, I'm going to do a rally on that day, like that is not even a dog whistle. That's just a whistle.
Exactly.
So, when people, one thing that was so disturbing to me early on in his work, and Kenrya and I had to deal with this at Color Lines, the question of, whether to call Trump a racist, like, should it be racially charged, or should it be intolerant, or, should it be, possibly, I don't even know what the euphemisms the rest of them are, but that hesitation to call someone who's an unreconstructed racist, who's telling you that they're a racist, and say, oh, I don't, like, it might be taking it too far to call him a racist, like, that's a failing of, not him, that's a failing of media, and that's the failing of how the United States deals with this clear legacy of white supremacy. Literally, you used to be socially punished for not being a full-throated white supremacist. And people forget that was within the lifetime of folks who, at least baby boomers. And so it's just it has been very frustrating with Trump, the amount of time that it took to call this man what he was telling you he is. And this idea that in some way to call out a system that is so obvious, and the system is not ashamed of itself. This new idea of we're going to conceal this, or we're going to not call it systemic, or we're not going to call it this, or we're not going to call it that. That's fairly new. The concept of white supremacy is as old as this country, and people owned up to it before. We're just in a newer moment when you look at this in the balance of history. People aren't ashamed. Nobody's slipping. It's sort of like, I didn't slip up, like, ooh, sorry, I did that racist thing. Like, you know what you're doing.
Yes.
The Amy Coopers of the world know what they're doing. Yes. They know what they're doing. And so this idea of like, I really dishonored myself is just sort of like, that's just part of the playbook, but you know what you're doing.
And I want to bring that back to Trump. I think, to say that this man is unfiltered is to suggest that he's saying these things by accident. And the reality is it's all calculated. He knows exactly what he's saying. He knows exactly who he's whistling to. He knows exactly who is listening and how they're going to take it and how they're going to react when he says it. There are no mistakes.
So the other thing, I guess, that often happens after, moments of upheaval like we have just seen is that corporate America says, we're going to do something about this. We're going to make this better. I think there are some corporations who probably genuinely are going to try and wrestle with racism within their workspaces and with an awareness that maybe they have not created perfect environments. Do you believe they can make a difference, or do you think this is going to be one of these things that they try for a little bit, maybe some incremental changes happen, maybe they slide away? Are you optimistic about any changes there?
I believe that they can. I think that the ones that do may be few and far between. I think that a lot of it comes down to what is your actual strategy. If the extent of the work that you are going to do is to post on social media a black and white image that says Black Lives Matter, then I have no faith in you. This feels like the same thing that companies do every June when they decide to turn everything rainbow for Pride, but they still have policies that allow them to be able to do awful things to people who are in the community. Shout out to the SCOTUS decision that we just got yesterday, which is pretty dope. I think that what I have seen a lot of happening, because I've gotten a lot of calls of people like, I don't know what to do, is that a lot of these organizations are turning to the Black people within their organizations and asking them, what should we do? And forming committees and giving them additional jobs on top of the ones that they are paid for that do not come with additional compensation or time off from the work that they were hired to do, in order to tell them how they should be better. And what I have been telling people who call me is, hey, you need to tell them that they need to bring in outside consultants that they pay. They pay when they want to do market research to figure out who they should sell things to. They pay when they find out that they have a gender equity problem and want to be able to figure out how they can attract women. They need to be doing the same thing in order to figure out how to best create environments in which Black people can not only get in, but thrive, where they are well supported, where they have the resources that they need to be able to actually do their work and to move forward in their careers. And I think that too often companies decide that they just, they're Black, they can figure it out. And I think that if that is the strategy, then the needle is going to stay right where it is.
I just want to add, I think one of the determining factors is whether or not this is an apology tour, whether or not this is about absolution for things that the particular individuals who are in place have done that they feel they want to, or they feel like now's the time for me to own up to it. And so I think about the controversy, quote unquote, at Condé Nast. This behemoth of elitism, racism, classism, sizeism. Like, their bread and butter has been all of the isms for so long. And having a moment where, someone like Anna Wintour can say, yeah, I'm sure it really sucks to work at Vogue when you're Black, as if she hasn't been a determining factor in creating that work environment.
As if the culture doesn't come from the top. What are you talking about?
Right. And so this is, if this is a moment where Condé Nast then gets to paint itself Black, that's a real problem. And also, there does need to be some, it's not just, sorry is not just, okay. Like, it's like, oops, sorry, I was sort of racist to you and derailed your entire career and burned you out. My fault. Like, that's not
your earning potential forever, all of those things.
Right. Or I went around and said you were too difficult to work with, but sorry about that. Like, that is not helpful. Obviously, there need to be, if we're talking about consumer products, there need to be clear finance. Like, there needs to be some sort of foundation, and it needs to not just be founded in marketing. Like, the foundation needs to be in pay equity. It needs to be in equity of expression. It needs to be that, if you do point out that something is racist, that you're not punished for it. But simply saying like solidarity with Black people is like woody who. You know what I mean? We already did this
all this time.
Beautiful. And how that got co-opted. We went through this in the 70s where a bunch of corporations, Black was beautiful to a certain extent, or, you involved people of color in your ads. The sum total is you're still just using us to sell your products.
So it's a conversation about power, isn't it? Are you prepared to hand over power to people who represent the Black interest?
Well, I think Black interest, but I also think class needs to go in there too, because the idea of finding like 3 Black people who are on your board of directors and everybody else in, say, a senior management is white is not particularly helpful. Like, I don't, I greatly admire sort of the corporate titans, the Black corporate titans whose names you read quite often. But that is obviously not doing the job. I would so much prefer, a $15 minimum wage and guaranteed lunch breaks and sick time and, childcare and vacation. Like, those are the sort of and for people who are middle class or working class or even poor, like that is so much more important than having, a Black person on your board of directors who is just only really going to deal with, by design, they're only going to deal with the financial health of the company.
I wanted to ask you about, to go back to the video that you mentioned the other day and how, it's a very complicated thing whether to watch these terrible events. Of the terrible things that have happened recently, the one that has I have found personally most chilling is the story of Ahmaud Arbery and what happened to him. And one of the things I found chilling is that we nearly missed it. That conversation had not registered on a national level until the terrible video surfaced. A video that it now turns out is probably going to get the person who took it sent to jail. This is the strangest corner of a terrible, terrible story. So, and we've had a conversation about police wearing body cams and trying to capture what they do. We're a very video-centric society now. I wonder if you could just talk to us a little bit about the power of video, the power of the image over the word, and whether you think we've got this right, or whether we're trapping ourselves by needing to see something before we believe that it's true.
Okay, so I believe that video has power in that it can mobilize people, in that it can cause those visceral reactions that we're talking about. I'm with Akiba. I watched the very beginning of the video because I had to edit a story about it, and then I had to turn it off because I was crying. And I back when Philando Castile was killed, I couldn't watch that video. I know you probably remember, Akiba. I ended up posting the transcript of the video on color lines with the caption, with the headline of for those of you who can't watch another, death of another Black person, because I can't do that anymore. I think, yes, that there are some people who maybe need to see it to believe it, but I feel that in my bones. I don't need to see it to know that it's happening. I carry that with me in my blood every day. I think that when we get to the point where we feel like we have to see a video to believe it, we've gone to a bad place. I also think that, that's one of the arguments that people use for reforms, like having officers have, body cameras and things like that. And I think that what the statistics show was that things like that don't actually deter police violence. They don't keep police from doing things. They turn them off. They get off anyway because they are able to use the blue wall and their police unions, surround them. And even though we saw it, they still get off. They still keep their jobs. They continue to be paid. They're still able to go out into the streets and they still get to kill everyone. And, this kind of thing really makes me think about one of the beautiful things that I think that has come out of all of this is that the conversation has really shifted from reform to abolition, and why incremental changes are not enough to save our lives. In our book, How We Fight White Supremacy, the final chapter talks about freedom dreaming, which comes from Robin D.G. Kelly's book, and it pushes people, Black people, all people, to really close our eyes and imagine a future that we don't have right now, in which the world is just and we all take care of each other. And your question makes me think about the fact that people who can't close their eyes and see that world, who have to see a video in order to even get an inkling of what that might look like, aren't really imaginative enough. Or maybe they're not observant enough. I feel like if they looked around, they'd see that we currently have a system that thinks it's cool to close schools and use them to train police, right? That defunds education and uses that money to fund policing. That expects that people who have 8 hours of training in de-escalation are the right people who you should call when somebody's in the throes of a mental health crisis. Fully 50% of the people who get killed by police are experiencing a mental health crisis, but we still think that they're the ones who we should be calling when all they're doing is what they were trained to do, which is to be violent. The reality to me, and what this brings up for me, is that reform hasn't really gotten us anywhere. Being able to see these videos that we've been watching that really started to proliferate 5 years ago, 6 years ago, hasn't gotten us anywhere. We right back in the streets again. I think that police are doing what they were created to do. They violently suppress the most marginalized among us in order to uphold the status quo. And until we can move away from the pictures and build in our minds ways that involve us taking money from the system of policing and imprisoning people and using that to take care of ourselves and of each other, we're going to continue to be here. We need to be thinking about ways that we can use that money to provide housing for the unhoused. We need to be thinking about putting in place and supporting culturally competent care for people both physically and mentally ill who need help. We need to be training community care workers who can help people who are in situations like what happened in Atlanta, where you're sleeping in your car and now you are gone. We need to be supporting schools that don't function as pipelines to prisons, that don't have officers walking around them because that's what we think keeps us safe when we know that it doesn't. It literally does the opposite. I think until we decide that we want to defund the police and pour our money into services that actually serve us, we're not really doing the work of defending Black lives.
That's an extraordinary, powerful note to end on, a call to action. I'm so happy that you were able to give us your time this morning as the authors of How We Fight White Supremacy. Thank you both, Akiba and Kenrya. And this has been The Current.
Hachette,